Hello, lords and ladies of the internet. I'm the King of Candor, and today we'll be talking about the history of Hobbits and Halflings. Now, before we start, Hobbits and Halflings are mostly the same creature, with Halflings being the one most fantasy authors use for legal reasons. With that out of the way, where did Hobbits come from? The first use of the word Hobbit is somewhat contested, as the word technically appears first as an obscure unit of measurement in northern Wales in the mid-19th century. However, it's spelt with an E, not an I, so it would be Hobbit. In his paper on the subject, Michael Flowers goes into depth of the word's usage and why it has a possibility of being linked to the word Hobbit, but it is unlikely in my opinion. The logic behind Hobbit being linked to Hobbit is because they both have something to do with agriculture and farming. That seems laughably thin to me. However, the paper is well researched. I'll also have another reason I want to talk about, but that'll come on later. So, the first time Hobbit with an I, and is related to fantastical elements appears, is in a series of pamphlets on English folklore called the Denham Tracts in 1853. These were sold in New York originally, and then reprinted and condensed in 1892 and 1895 by James Hardy for the Folklore Society. In all of my research, I have found no connection between Tolkien and the Society, and Tolkien scholar Tom Shippey agrees with me that the connection is probably non-existent. Tom Shippey further clarifies his reasoning in the book Road to Middle-earth, noting that the list was of ghostly creatures without bodies, more akin to fairies and sprites, nothing like Tolkien's solid flesh and blood hobbits. So, if not Welsh agricultural measurements or the Denham Tracts, then where do hobbits come from? According to Tolkien himself, he was grading papers one day, a boring task which caused his mind to wander. He turned to a blank page of a student's essay and began writing notes, but he accidentally doodled the phrase, "In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit." Tolkien would often tell the story and was unsure what a hobbit was or why it lived in a hole in the ground, but he decided he would find out one day, so sat down to write The Hobbit. Over the years, people have asked Tolkien where his inspiration has come from, and he gave two sources as minor inspirations: The Babbit by Lewis Sinclair and the Snergs from Edward Wyke Smith's 1927 book, The Marvelous Land of Snergs. So let's break these down. The Babbit by Lewis Sinclair contributed a sound-alike with the title at best, as nothing in the book really fits hobbits. Babbit is a satirical breakdown of American society and how the middle class strives for comfort, not greatness. Tolkien admitted to Harry C. Bauer in a letter that he thinks that the Hobbit word has something to do with Babbit. Unfortunately, this is a reply, and a short one at that, and the original question posed by Harry C. Bauer has been lost. The letter is linked below if you'd like to try to read it. Originally, I had it on screen here, but I was informed that Tolkien Estate holds the copyright of the letter, and thus I can't display it. Now for the bigger of the two connections. The secret origin of hobbits they don't want you to know. The Snergs. Before I go on, yes, this has to be one of the goofiest names I've ever heard. However, these noble Snergs are credited by Tolkien as a partial influence on the hobbits. This is found in the letter to a Poet, W. H. Auden, also linked below. Tolkien's direct quote is, "Not any better than I think than The Marvelous Land of Snergs, White Smith, Ernest Benn, 1927. Seeing the date, I should say this was probably an unconscious source book for the hobbits, not of anything else." Tolkien's words himself, so there we go. Snergs are the original hobbit. Now, what about these Snergs makes them hobbit-like? Obviously, the word Snerg has nothing to do with hobbit. So, in the tale, Snergs are described as around 3 feet tall, or table height, with a love of communal feasting, and having some strange names, such as Gorbo and Bilbo. The land of Snergs also has many evil witches and ogres, and involves journeys through dangerous caves and forests. So now we are finally at the hobbits that we all know. We can see through all of these sources how Tolkien developed them into the creatures we know today. Hobbits in Tolkien's work are best described as an ideal everyman. They desire to do the right thing and enjoy life. Their local community is what matters to them, and they are brave beyond their station. One more important thing to note is also how sneaky hobbits can be. Their short stature and soft feet make ideal thieves, as shown by Bilbo during the events of The Hobbit. Tolkien gave this race life and a name, as he was inspired by writings before him. So would other writers carry the hobbits into the modern halflings. As fantasy grew, and works like Dungeons and Dragons grew in prominence, a push to add rules to play as a hobbit was sought. One of the first designers, Gary Gygax, was hesitant to do so, because he preferred the works of Jack Vance and other pulp authors to the grand epics that Tolkien wrote. He eventually was convinced to do so in order to help recreate certain battles. Probably the Scouring of the Shire from the end of Return of the King, if I had to guess. Now, when making the rules, Gary and company used the thieving skills Bilbo was said to possess to make them scouts and archers, with hobbits being less skilled at using bows and more with slings to give them a unique flavor. Side note, slings are actually highly lethal, and there's a reason sling ammunition is called a bullet. You can look up videos on the lethality if you wish. Hobbit was used in the D&D manuals and chainmail manuals for a while, until they were given a cease and desist letter in 1978 from the Tolkien estate. The name was then switched to Halfling, a name which was used in Lord of the Rings for hobbits as a bit of a pejorative term, but it also derives its roots from the Scottish word Halfling, which describes a boy-sized man. When designing these halflings, much like the half-ogre I mentioned in the orc video, their size eventually became a problem. Halflings were too short and light, being only 30 pounds. They realized they would need to increase the weight of the halfling and the size to make them actually playable. This is where the taller halflings can reach up to 4 feet were finally born. As halflings were becoming more solidified in Dungeons and Dragons and associated products, they ran into a bit of an issue: the half-races. The term halfling was used by Terry Brooks in his Shannara series and by Jack Vance to describe beings of both earth and magic, such as fairies, trolls, and ogres. For the next few decades, halfling was used for both hobbits and races which are of a mixed nature. Born of a fire elemental, you became a halfling. This wasn't true in Dungeons & Dragons, but other fantasy products did use this term. Eventually, D&D's usage won out, with the term now being solidly associated with hobbit folk. Even now, though, you see a forum post crop up once in a while, asking if halflings are humans mixed with dwarves, which is why in some settings like Shadowrun, they make them a subrace or an offshoot of dwarves. I would also like to point out here that halflings and gnomes are both very different, yet occupy the, quote, short folk space so many sandings have, so one often gets cut out to favor the other. Unfortunately, that's the end of the development for most of the Hobbit/Halfling people. They haven't really progressed much beyond their agrarian communities, hobbit hole dwellings, love of food, and all the other traits Tolkien gave them. So this next section, I'll just be speedrunning through a few examples where people pulled the halflings differently, but they really aren't as estranged from Tolkien as you'd expect. We're going to start with the Kender from Dragonlance. I'm sorry for the horror stories that I just brought back up for a lot of people, but they do have an interesting, unique quirk that they're all accidental thieves. This is because their society does not have personal property, and items are more shared, which is a twist that they added to add why halflings are considered thieves. Warhammer Fantasy also keeps this, but they also add in a bit of culinary fun, giving halflings the ability to, quote, cook a delicious meal from any ingredients, which I think is kind of cute. On the subject of halfling cuisine, I would say Dark Sun has probably got some uniqueness, since all the halflings there are jungle-dwelling cannibals. Now, they still pretty much are halflings at heart, as they keep a lot of the community aspects and small clans and have a social structure that's very reminiscent of Tolkien's, just in the jungle with more cannibals. Now, I will give a special shout out to my favorite halflings that have been altered from a fantasy project as to Eberron. Most of the halflings there are the same, however, there's a group of them that live out in the plains and ride dinosaurs, which, that's pretty awesome. In my own personal game, Enos, that I'm designing, the halflings I have are actually known as the Venetti. They keep a lot of the social cues and tight-knit family structures that you'd expect to see in halflings. However, they also travel the world and are great explorers and sailors, with many of the Venetti craving that freedom that you get from being a wandering adventurer or out on the open sea. Well, thank you for watching this far, and if you enjoyed the content, I'd appreciate if you give it a like and you subscribed. As always, I'd appreciate your candor in the comments below, and I'll see you next time.